Hello, my name is Connor.
And I'm Jason.
And you're listening to the Amazed and Perplexed podcast.
I want to welcome you to Matthew chapter 13 as we continue to be amazed and perplexed by Jesus, and specifically putting ourselves in the audience, looking around the proverbial room, and that could be culture or specific context, the people involved, but trying to get a feel to give dignity to the situation, to give dignity to the people, and how does that affect the way we hear Jesus' words, and kind of getting into their minds about how that would have resonated with them. Mm-hmm. And so, as is our practice, Connor, anything that jumps out before we read into this, not read into, but, well, we are reading into. Let's re-edit this thing. Anyway, before we read this parable.
Yeah. So I would say when we think about how anybody thinks about societal problems, religious organization problems, political problems, we almost always think about it from the negative. We think about it from the enemy perspective, from the what is wrong with this situation, and how do we address that? And there's a lot of reasons, like you could go biologically why we're like driven to always focus on the negative, as opposed to like, well, how do we make the system better? Or how do we make the church better? Or how do we do that? Almost always the thing that draws us and the thing that really motivates people to move is like, how do we get this ugliness out of it? How do we get these people to stop doing this or that? Or how do we get them away from us? And that just tends to be, even if you use better language, we are always approaching things from this perspective, generally speaking, of negative forward, as opposed to how do we change things positively. It's much more about negative forward. And I think it would have been, I think it's so important to always put it out in front of us. It would have been very similar to how the Jews in Jesus' day perceive the world. They had different cultural things going on that we've touched on before. They have different expectations than like what we would have on wanting societal or political or religious change today. But at the base, they are still biological humans, driven so much by negativity and what's wrong with things. And so the urge that you and I feel when we see something really wrong happen, to want to rip the bad things out. It is so strongly built in us, and it would have been the exact same for them. So when you see a problem in the church, when you see a problem with society or political things or whatever it may be, and you're like, man, we got to clear this out and we got to do a whole new thing, and you feel that deeply and strongly, I want to give dignity that they would have those exact same feelings, that exact same tendency to want to be negative facing forward, like be negative first. They would have had those same exact feelings as you, just as strongly, and in their minds, as in our minds, just as legitimately.
I really appreciate that. It's a gut punch when you have those expectations. This parable is a gut punch. And so I'm intrigued with where, the Spirit will take us as we discuss it, because it is one of those things that I think could be baseline. And I certainly don't want to repeat what you said. You said it really well, but I can't emphasize enough that this would be the way. If you ask me, well, what would Jesus do? I would be like, well, Jesus would clear this place out. Yeah. And I always go to the one time he cleared something out, the temple. I hear this. It's stunning. He only did it one time, but as much as I hear about it, you think he was clearing the table or the temple like every half hour, Yeah. But it's like, yeah, obviously, Jesus would say the evil has to stop. Yeah. And it'll be allowed no more. And now we're going to build this better world. We're going to bring heaven to earth.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that would be the expectation. And I think I've even heard very similar things talked about with like professional people in church of like, well, we got to tear this down. We got to get clear all this negative stuff out. Basically, I've even heard people talk about that when they want to take a church a new direction. It's like, let's just treat this as a church plant. Let's like if you get caught up in trying to reform or change the way this has been, you're not going to get anywhere. Let's just rip everything out and go.
Yeah, exactly. And I think that is just so important. I'll jump into reading. But to have that on our minds of here's the right answer. You just need to tear it all up and start all over, you know? So much so that we have really cruel phrases like, don't throw the baby out with the bathwater. Why? Because everybody throws the baby out with the bathwater. And if you don't know what that means, then I apologize for using it. It's really cruel. Anyway, verse 24 of Matthew chapter 13. Jesus told them another parable. And really quickly, he's with his apostles. They pulled him aside to interpret another, a previous parable. And so it's a little bit confusing when the crowd gets back into it. But you have we have like 2 or 3 parables right in a row, and it just says them. He told them. And then at the very end, it's like, and the crowd. So you're like, I don't know who's listening, but we do know for sure the apostles are listening. And at some point, the remainder of the group come around to hear him. But he says he told them another parable. The kingdom of heaven is like a man who sowed good seed in his field. But while everyone was sleeping, his enemy came and sowed weeds among the wheat and went away. When the wheat sprouted and formed heads, then the weeds also appeared. The owner's servants came to him and said, Sir, didn't you sow good seed in your field? Where then did the weeds come from? An enemy did this, he replied. The servants asked him, Do you want us to go and pull them up? No, he answered, because while you're pulling the weeds, you may uproot the wheat with them. Let both grow together until the harvest. At that time I will tell the harvesters, first collect the weeds and tie them in bundles to be burned. Then gather the wheat and bring it into my barn. So, yeah, this is like when we cover the parable of the hiring the workers, and some get hired at 9, and I have that feeling of dissatisfaction right now. But how does that hit you? Let's start with the positive. Like, what amazes you?
For me, this is one of those ones that's come back around for me of just being, like even just here. I mean, I've been looking at this parable and these parables a lot recently, not even to do with our podcast, but they've just been sitting with me, and they've come around from being really confusing and like giving me that ick feeling. You're just like, man, this is the thing that just draws me so close to Jesus. I am a horrible weed eater. I am just abysmal at it. When Hannah and I, my wife and I, we love to garden. We love to plant things, and sometimes we have success, sometimes we don't. We've talked about this many times. Inevitably, what will happen? So this is our first year in our new house, and we planted some things, and some came to harvest, and then some didn't and got neglected. And there's going to come a point where next year the temptation is like, you know, what we need to do. We need to go to the store. We need to just take the weed eater out, start spraying stuff, and then you rip it all out, and we'll go again. And inevitably, my natural draw is to just take everything out, to negate any previous work, and like both in my spiritual life and in literal farming. And there's just this thing that goes like, as often as I can work with plants, as often as I can work with particular vines or fruits or vegetables, I will always mess up to one degree. I will always pull up I will always pull up a good harvest in my attempt to pull weeds. I'll always have that bad outcome in one way. And when I think about it and I go, okay, yeah, what's the big deal? I had some tomatoes that would have been great harvest down the road that got yanked up too early, and then they wither and they're no good to anybody. But if those are actual people, like if those are actual people that I'm wanting to take a weed eater to, like then that just becomes so much more staggering. If I begin to think about these people, about like what Jesus is speaking to here, and it's this tendency in the human heart to be like, no, my job is to clear everything out. God wants me to be the person deciding yes, no, maybe, we'll come back later. No, yes. Jesus knows that we're awful at it. God knows that we just can't do this well. And we are predisposed to think that this is what we're supposed to do. And so that Jesus gives us this freedom and says, no, you're bad at it, and I don't even want you to be good at it.
Yeah.
I don't want you to attempt to like cultivate a good skill of being able to determine, really get in like nitty gritty to find out, is this a weed or is this a good, bit of wheat? Like there's part of that here, but Jesus knows that I'm bad about it. And he's not like, hey, Connor, I need you to be better. I need you to strive and be better. He's like, no, that's not at all what I want from you. It's revolutionary. It's radical. It's beautiful. And it's when you can actually live it, because it goes against a lot of the things I talked about early on, that natural instinct we have to be negative facing forward first. It's freeing.
So very good. That is so very good. And it's funny because even just in these moments, when you started talking about now when it's people, you made the transition from thinking in the plant world to people. At first, I'm like, it's not people, Connor. We're not talking about people. We're talking about evil. And the devil can't, work on his own apart from people. But most of the ways that the devil gets to you is through people. It's through people who have free will and make choices. Now, it may end up as a corporation that's evil or a system that's evil or a government that's evil, but it's people, because it's not possible, and you know this in your own experience, it's not possible for me to go and remove the evil from myself without removing myself. And it's not because I'm fully evil, it's because it's all mixed up in there. So even within me, I have good seed growing, and then I have weeds growing. And so I think, and that's not even what I was thinking about for Amazing Me, but I think I need to shift to this because it really is amazing. He's talking about the condition of my heart, which I continually try to deny when there's trouble, because functionally, and this goes back to that outwardly looking for negative, it's like I want something else to blame. We're recording this, and there's a national election coming up, and it's the kind of thing where you want somebody to blame. You do, because you feel like the people in this story feel. There is bad stuff that will hurt us, and we use words like this candidate will destroy democracy or ruin our country or ruin our economy or ruin our whatever, and I'm telling you, it doesn't matter which election, they pretty much say the same thing. It doesn't matter who's running, they pretty much say the same thing. But it's simply an expression of the frustration that we feel like to say, it's so easy, just remove those problems, which typically means just remove those people, because it doesn't start vaguely out there in the air. It's not like amoebas are mass producing and becoming these problems to us. It's humans make choices that eventually create systems that hurt.
Yeah. So I might cut this out. I might leave it in. I had this where recording this right after where the debate happened, and there was the whole thing with Springfield, Ohio, and Haitians, and whatever you think about that. And I saw this person say, "Man, if Christians really believed that there were Haitian refugees, or however what the technical term would be, that are so hungry that they are resorting, if this was true, which I don't think it is, but if it was true that they're resorting to capturing domesticated animals and eating them, then why is the Christian response, oh God, they're hungry, like they need help, as opposed to we need to rip them out of here, like there's too many of them, there's too, like what the Christian response, right? And seeing, let's just, I don't think this is the case, but say worst case scenario is like, yeah, they're like, even like they're culturally backwards and they're doing all these bad things. The Christian response should not be, we need to rip them out and get them away because they're going to taint everything else in the good fruit. The Christian response is, oh man, like there's good wheat in there. There's good wheat that like can, and so like, this is the compelling, the thing that moves me forward. I think the thing that when I think about the rest of my life, the thing that moves me forward, that I want to move towards, is my initial reaction when I see mess or negativity or weeds is to run away. It's to run away. And then it's to, no, I got to rip and pull everything out. And that's not what Jesus does. He moves toward, like, God, it's God's job to determine what is good and what isn't, what is a good harvest and what are weeds. But my response is I want my life to be about a life that moves towards the weeds, moves towards the wheat, because there's a lot of things mixing up in here in between different parables and different teachings of Jesus, but yeah, I just feel so compelled by this, and reminding myself, you said something, it's pulling back, you said something about how about this is happening in my heart, this is happening in my soul, this dichotomy between the good and the bad in my own heart, and recognizing, oh, Jesus in a way this is part of just being a faithful follower of Jesus is Jesus going to sift through me. And I think if I love and I follow him, then, and I'm a disciple and I follow his commandments, that he is along the way helping separate the weeds and helping lovingly pull them away. Like this is just so all encompassing in terms of like both the personal and the big. And anytime I get too focused on, well, what does this mean for the societal implications? And it gets far away from my actions and whether I'm, it gets far away from my own actions, then I've missed all of what Jesus is getting at.
Absolutely. And I think that transformation, I was just thinking about Philippians 3, where it's like, look, you're going to be transformed with resurrection power. And it's talking about our lowly body specifically in the NIV there. But I think it involves, he's not just like, man, we perfected the body, but all that bad stuff in your spirit, that's still, we're stuck with that. He's not saying that.
Yeah.
We're going to become like him and not just like physically like him, although I think it does have physical application. And no matter how much he does prune us, now I'm drawing off yet another, at least metaphor, but it's that idea of we're going to need transformation before we can be with God. Mm-hmm. We're going to need to be transformed into the image of him like they had in the garden, you know, and all that tainting and just corruption, that happened there. And so and both things are true. Am I being pruned now? Mm-hmm. The stuff being cut away from me that's not like Christ. If I want to pursue Christ, if I'm wanting that, if I have a heart after him, but no matter how much I do, I will still ultimately need to be transformed. And the reason I'm saying that is part of what allows this to continue, this view, is that same thing as what's it, Luke 19, that Pharisee and tax collector. It's like, well, at least I'm better than this guy.
Yeah.
I still don't believe that there is no difference. Mm-hmm. I still believe that the drug addict is somehow worse than me, And yes, the drug addict, the murderer may have a bigger negative impact on its world. I'm not suggesting my choosing to do good things and be kind, and that's the dominant thought, not the always thought, but the dominant thought. I'm not suggesting it doesn't produce better things, but I am saying this all still comes from that thing that, well, I'm closer to Jesus because I'm morally superior and my, whatever we say, our doctrine, our teaching, our thinking is more like him. And it's like, it is on one hand in the sense that yes, that's better, but in terms of value and the closeness to God, my closeness to God is always going to be dependent on me being saved by Jesus, which includes an ultimate transformation, because I'm just not going to get there.
Well, and it takes reminding yourself. I think oftentimes, because I think we live in America, and so there's the long history of pulling yourself up by your own bootstraps. And as much as we might pretend like we don't have that mentality, hasn't infected like us and the church, I see that in myself all the time. Where like my perspective so often when I think about who I am now and where and how far I've come, or how much more I'm like Jesus, even if I can couch it in the right language, so much of it feels like, well, man, I got in there and I started digging and pulling stuff up, and I really it was a lot of hard work. It was messiness. And to a degree, there's a part of that like there's some truth in terms of like hard work, and there is a part of denying yourself that's hard work and becoming more like Jesus. But then the part has to realize like, oh, any time in my life that if I actually drill down on that thought, any time in my life where I have gone at my own soul and been like, okay, Connor, it's time to rip up the weeds here. It's time to you're doing this and it's time to cut that out. Or like you have this problem, or you have this bad thought pattern, or you have this prejudice, or whatever it would be. And now it's time to rip it up. It's never worked. Not one time has it ever worked. It's only ever been through like loving and trusting Jesus and allowing him to come alongside me and slowly rip those things out of me that there's been success. And I can recognize that and know that. But if I don't keep that in front of me, I then begin to buy in this myth that I actually pulled myself up by my own bootstraps, that somehow it's, even if, yes, I made the positive affirmation, like, yes, Jesus, come change me, rip the things out, even if it's painful, he'll do that. And then there's this ever-growing creep of this temptation to be like, yeah, but when push came to shove, Connor, like you did this and that person didn't do that, and it's just like, this is a good reminder for me to go like, thank God that is not how we change, because I would not be any closer to Jesus if it was all in my power to pull up the weeds in my own heart. And so I'm thankful for it, but it's something that we always have to be on guard about.
I totally agree, and I think that I do have a love-hate with this scripture, in the sense that it complicates and liberates, in that way. So I'm curious, when you think about confusing pieces, because in some ways I feel like, man, I understand this so very much better than 5 years ago. But what perplexes you about this?
Yeah, and this gets always to the thing we talk about with parables and how much to read into it, how far to apply it. I don't know. Specifically in 29 or in 30, Jesus says, "Let both grow together until the harvest, and at that time I will tell the harvesters, first collect the weeds and tie them in bundles." Yada yada yada. I didn't mean to yada yada yada. Jesus, that sounds bad.
We're gonna have to start over.
Yeah. Oh no, we'll have to. If you publish it on the podcast, then it's really a sin, as opposed to like saying it out loud.
Oh yeah, right. The stuff we said before we hit record. Yeah, that doesn't count at all.
God doesn't hear things unless they're on podcast. That's what. Yeah, I'm just kidding. So what's perplexing to me about this is like Jesus talking about this. There's so many levels to what Jesus is saying here, but I think on the first level, on the clearest level that we can get, there's an element here that Jesus is speaking about: saved, unsaved, people who are followers of Jesus, who've accepted him, and then people who, because of allowing whatever are unsaved. And so the timeline is so confusing to me. The way Jesus phrased, "Let both grow together until the harvest." And so if I'm thinking about the harvest, I'm thinking about the judgment day or death. Let both grow together. And this again stretches, how far should we stretch a parable and its logical implications? I'm struck with like, I know when I know I'm a bad weed eater, but there are certain circumstances where something will be good. I'm like, wow, if something doesn't take that weed out, it's going to choke the life out of that fruit or out of that wheat. And so I'm just struck here with like, it's beautiful. I get it. And there's an element, I think, like you talked about, of ongoing weed eating that Jesus does to the people that will accept it. But I'm also more like, but the timeline doesn't sit well with me. I'm like, why do they have to grow together? Like, why does it have to be this way?
Yeah, I think that's ultimately what perplexes me, is the dynamic of where does accountability, rebuke, that disfellowshipping, which I think disfellowshipping in modern day church makes very little sense, simply because to disfellowship someone, you have to have fellowship with them. And a lot of times the people that you'd be like, well, they're sinning in a way that really hurts this community, typically they've withdrawn from the community. So what is it you're taking away from them? But I still think, so the subject of church discipline, I still think I think it's needed. I think I need to have people, brothers and sisters, come alongside and say, here's what I think you need to be watching out for. And I think part of the reason why it scares us so much is how many times have people done that to you and you really knew they loved you. Mm. And they weren't just saying, please stop this bad behavior because I don't like it. It makes me uncomfortable. But really, I love you so much and I value your soul so much, I'm taking the risk to say, I think this is really going to hurt you. And those stand out. When I've done it, when I've seen other people do it, it's not the norm.
Yeah.
And anything we haven't seen happen a million times, it's kind of hard to imagine it happening. So there is that piece. I think, and this, what you said is exactly important. You always have to remember this when you read a parable. So even you saying it, I'm like, yeah, that's true. And maybe I was the first one to say it in our conversations in general, sure. but I'm like, I needed that reminder because this is not doctrine. It's a picture.
Yeah.
It's a story that has these are the earthly dynamics. And then it's a picture of things that are happening spiritually. Mm-hmm. And so there are a lot of loose ends here. Now, he does interpret this down the road, like down the verses. But when we do Amazed and Perplexed, we're, to some degree, we're reading it as if we've never read the rest. So we're just dealing with the parable as it is right now. And then when we get to the interpretation, a few weeks from now, a few episodes from now, then we'll process that more. But yes, just specifically coming from there, it's that idea of what does tear them up mean, and might that suggest there's an intermediate form of this? In other words, if I'm talking about the weeds that are growing in you, or the weeds that are growing in me, and I'm inviting you in, man, I need accountability on this, because I know when I just do it, I go on autopilot, stop thinking about it. But knowing you're praying for me, knowing not only do I get whatever the Holy Spirit would do through those prayers, but I have that reminder to say, hey, you got a choice here. This will hurt you ultimately. And so is that a pruning that's not a pull it up, kind of thing? And again, now we're mixing two different pictures,
sure,
from John 15 and now this context. But at the end of the day, I don't know.
Yeah.
This is something I have to choose all the time to walk by faith in, because I know way too much about the people that are in my world. Quincy Rush one time was telling me way back. So I still sometimes speak to the Adventures in Missions program down in Lubbock, Texas. And one day I had come in to speak at something, and Quincy was there, and he knew me because he used to live here in Tulsa, but he didn't know they knew me. The surrounding AIM students, because he was just visiting. It wasn't his particular class. And he goes, hey, there's Jason Thornton. And everybody kind of leaned away, like physically withdrew. And he's like, don't you like Jason? He's like, oh, he knows too much about us. And so now that made me sad. I'm like, oh, I got to figure out how to bridge that gap. But because I tend to lead with honesty, people feel more open to be honest. But then there's that residual effect a year later, 2 years later. It's like, oh, and I felt that before about people that I've been in a relationship with, or maybe we have an intense dynamic in a moment, but then 6 months later, I'm like, oh yeah, I wonder how that's going, But to invite that in is going to take faith, not protocol, not steps, faith. And then to learn to live together with that, that's going to take a lot of faith, because there are times when people come at me so strong, it very much feels like they're trying to pull it all. They're trying to just basically eliminate my personality, because we do not know, no matter how good we are at this, we do not know what part is God leaving in there. Like for Paul, if you come around, here's another planting metaphor. Paul, I see you have this thorn in the flesh. That's got to go. Mm-hmm. And Paul says, well, God told me he's going to leave it in. It's like, no, I know better than God. Now, once you walk through that mental process, you're like, oh, I don't know better than God. But it's this idea. And that doesn't mean, now here's another perplexion. Oh, man, does that mean I just leave it? I know I have this bad habit, this bad thought process. Do I just leave it? Yeah. Because of other passages with clear instruction, not parables, we know that doesn't help us. Yeah. But still, sure. I'm just saying, it is not cut and dry.
It's not cut and dry. And I think we all have different sides of the pendulum we're going to swing to. I think there's an important part here. The temptation, there's a very strong temptation with most of us when we think about like even unsaved people, and think about Paul, and you think about before Jesus, kicks him into the dirt, and he gets saved. Persecuting, going after Christians, not the best guy. Very proactive in terms of his persecution of Jesus followers. And there's this thing where we have this tendency when we think about like, okay, well, what does saved Paul look like? And you've made this point to me so many times. Like, what does saved Paul look like? Well, he looks in a lot of ways very similar to pre-saved Paul, but like all the all the good parts, all the parts like the divine spark and all the good things that were in Paul are just magnified, and so many of the other things have been stripped away and pulled away, and the new thing and the good things reframed and refocused in healthy and Jesus honoring ways. And I think there's this very easy temptation for us to view people as all weeds, to view all situations, all organizations, and all humans as like in any given circumstance to be, oh, it's just all weeds. It all needs to come up. And if you follow Jesus for any amount of time, to know like so much of what the work of God in my life and discipling is recognizing, oh, God has made me uniquely. And so that means my path as a follower and a disciple is unique and is going to look it's going to look different than yours, and it's going to look different from anybody else's because I have a unique relationship with God. And there's some similar, like, this is not new ground we're covering here, but I think in terms of relating this to the parable of the weeds here, there's a large chunk of us that need to constantly be reminding ourselves that when we're struggling with like a specific person or a group of people or just not getting it, anytime you look at a person and you assume that it's all like all they have in their life is weeds, you miss the image of God in them. Anytime you look at an organization, religious, political, social, and you go, let's just rip it all up, there's nothing good can come of it. It needs to be taken down. We need to take a weed eater. We need to get that like really toxic spray that just like kills everything. That's not how God's operating. And it's also a denial that God has already been up to something. I think the temptation for us to want to take things down and to rip out all the weeds ourselves is this selfish belief that I've come onto the scene now, and so God's really kicked plans into gear. But if we're followers of Jesus and we believe people have been doing this now for 2,000 years, and there have been people planting seeds for 2,000 years, and God has been working in my life and your life, then it becomes so much easier to recognize, like, oh yeah, there are people that there are seeds planted everywhere around me, and there are seeds that you've planted and that I've planted, good seeds that are going to come to harvest. And when we begin to think that, like, oh, Jesus has sent me on a rocket ship on this direct mission, like now is when God gets really serious in terms of how things are going. It's a denial that God has already been up to business and already doing things and already working and already planting seeds, and there's already great fruit to be a part of. And so I think that's my personal challenge, is recognizing when that temptation comes, it's ultimately a selfish belief that, like, well, God's really working through me. He might be working through you, Jason, but he's really working through me. But when I can recognize, no, when like God wants to work through Jason just as badly as he wants to work through me, and when we're both living that out, even if I can't see it maybe in a necessary moment, I have to believe, because Jason is following Jesus, there is like, even if you're in a really rough position in life and there's so many weeds that are really ugly, I have to believe that there is good wheat in there.
Yeah, I think that's a beautiful ending, and it really is the counter to where we started about that recognition that, man, most of the time, if there's something uncomfortable or even something obviously evil, my defense, without even thinking about it, is I'm forward-looking negative, and I'm looking for the disadvantage, the negative, the things. And again, discernment does mean that you notice the difference between right and wrong, but it does not mean you're obsessed with wrong.
Yeah.
The reason you're even noticing the wrong is you're asking God, what can be done about that? But recognizing his primary solution isn't to rip it up. Now, something else just totally popped in my mind, which we will not have time for. In the Old Testament and in, Acts 5, when Ananias and Sapphira come up, he chooses in that time, in various stories in the Old Testament, to rip it up. These people die immediately, and I think there are special circumstances. There's something he's wanting to teach the community when the community is very young. I think all that's true. But the point is, number one, it's a parable. It's not doctrine. He's not committing to never just saying, hey, there's evil here, I'm going to destroy it right away. Yeah. You know what I mean? But this goes to that. Why, if God is good, why is there evil in the world? Well, this is why. I don't think you only. I think there are other things beside this parable that speak to this of why there's evil in the world. But it is that idea of this takes my expectations and says, hey, there may be some other things going on here. And this just leads me back to, Jason, are you willing to trust me with this? This is God talking to me. The weeds in Connor's life, the weeds of the world, the weeds in our politics, our governments, all these kind of things. That's the big question. He's never asking, Jason, I really need your ideas on how to fix this, which is what it is I assume when I go in and say, I've got to fix this. It's more about, God, is there anything you would lead me to do to really not even fix this, but help people to see you more? Because that's the cause and effect. Me fixing it doesn't necessarily lead people to God. But me focusing on God and then possibly things being fixed, there's a high potential they'll notice God in that. And that's where my takeaway from this is to breathe easy. I'm liberated from having to be the judge of the world, and to recognize he knows what he's doing.
Yeah. And before we wrap up, I do want to own, there is, Jesus will give his explainer down the road, and we'll cover that eventually. And so I don't want to run away. I think the obvious perplexion, and a lot of people are going to naturally be drawn to wonder, wait, the weeds and tie them in bundles and they're burned. That could be, we'll talk about that nature, and Jesus gets much more direct about what that looks like. And so that seems like that would have been something a year ago or 2 years ago. I would have been like, that's all I would have been focused on. It would have been that final part of what Jesus says here. And so I want to own that there's probably some people out there that would hear that and be like, well, you didn't touch on this piece, and what does that mean? And so I think eventually grace, peace, and love.